ProfsCast with Professor Fensterle and guests. Yeah, welcome to the ProfsCast. Today we have a special edition. It's a Lectures for Future. And our guest today is Professor Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker. Before we start, I want to tell you, why should we talk about Lectures for Future? Why is climate still an issue? So I'm standing here in front of this beautiful scenery. You see it's near Würzburg, the region with the river Main. Everything is beautiful. Where is the problem? We have Corona. This is a problem. But is climate still a problem? Well, against Corona, we will have a vaccine soon. Against the climate change, we will not have a vaccine. And I'm taking this example of Würzburg because everything looks fine here. We have a nice weather. It's end of November. It's cold. So is there a climate change? And yes, here, where I'm standing actually, here is the climate change. So Professor Pett from the University of Würzburg, for example, in a study has shown that here the increase of the temperature locally is already at 2 degrees. And we see the consequences already. Conifers like pine or spruces are actually dying in these forests. And if I look at my normal jogging trail where I jog 2 times a week, hopefully, sometimes it's just 1 time a week. Me, as a complete lay in botany, is already seeing that. And this is not a good sign because they're simply dead. Within the last 3 years, a couple of these conifers were dying. And here, what you see here is a region where they were completely gone. So no more there. They had to be eliminated. And now new trees have been planted because they were dead. So there is the need to talk about climate. There will be no vaccine against the climate change, and therefore it's important that we talk about climate today with my guest, Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker. Yeah, welcome to this special Lectures for Future edition of the ProfsCast. My name is Joe Fensterle of the Rhine-Waal University of Applied Science in Kleve, and I'm very happy to welcome as my guest today Professor Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker. Professor Weizsäcker, welcome to the ProfsCast. It's a real honor to have you here.
It's my honor, Joe. And just call me Ernst. That's fine.
Oh, that's really cool that you can call me Joe. This is of course yeah. Thanks a lot, Ernst. Now, let's start right away with a point, maybe thanks to Fridays for Future, everybody now talks about climate change today. But if I say that you especially started about thinking of the climate change and sustainability long before, most likely, most students were born who are listeners, and even maybe long before I was born, is that correct?
Well, look, I did studies in physics to the diploma, the master's. At that time, the concern of people talking about climate was that we are running into a new ice age. You know?
Yeah.
It was in the 1950s and 60s. The idea of global warming came up in the mid-80s with the research into the chemical composition of air bubbles in the fossil ice of Greenland or the Antarctic. And there they discovered, in an indirect method, that 160,000 years ago, it was warm. And then it was cool. And the difference was 5 degrees or so. And then they also discovered that the sea level was very different depending on the atmospheric temperatures. And that then, after a lot of talking and discussing during the second half of the 1980s, the cry of alarm came up, and the German parliament established a special committee on global warming. That was, so it's not so long ago, 30 years ago, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then it so happened that they allowed me to be the founding president of a new institute, the Wuppertal Institute for Climate, Environment and Energy, which was meant as a think tank on policy questions of climate change.
Mm-hmm. So we will talk about this Wuppertal Institute, which is certainly one of the milestones in this respect later. But maybe at the very beginning, is talking about climate change. Today, there are people doubting whether the climate change exists. So you said 30, 40 years ago, people were afraid of it's getting warmer. But if you look at the situation today, is there any doubt that this man-made climate change is real?
Well, one thing is absolutely undisputed, namely that the atmosphere of the Earth over the past 2 or 3 billion years has been changing. There were ice ages, there were hot ages, and the discovery that carbon dioxide concentrations happen to be an indicator of heat. That discovery was made in the late 19th century by a Swedish astrophysicist, Svante Arrhenius, and this had nothing to do with human influence. It was simply an observation of radiation patterns.
Mm-hmm.
But then already Arrhenius noted that the early industrialization of the 19th century could lead to global warming. He published that in, I believe, 1897 or so. And he said perhaps some 3 degrees centigrade would be the difference between an industrialized world and a pre-industrial world. And this was rediscovered almost exactly 100 years later as a fact.
Yeah. So we're now at the level of a fact, in other words. So now, is anyone talking about the fear that it's getting colder, or do we already observe that it's getting warmer today?
Well, there are different elements. One, indeed, is just temperature and carbon dioxide emissions. The so-called Keeling curve, which is the rise of carbon dioxide concentrations on Earth. This is undoubted, and also the temperatures on Earth are empirically rising. In the meantime, we have reached something like 1.2 or 0.3 degrees centigrade since the pre-industrial age. And now the discussion is, of course, the political discussion, can we stop it at roughly 1.5 degrees? Or can we afford going to 2 degrees? But what politics of today and trends worldwide are telling us is that we will end up with 4 degrees or 5 degrees centigrade higher than pre-industrial, and that could mean a sea level rise of something like 5 or perhaps even 20 meters. That would mean that Amsterdam and Venice and Hamburg and half of Bangladesh would be underwater. And that would be a disaster worse than any disaster that has happened over the last 100,000 years.
But this is a disaster, that's clear. But now, if I would say, well, I'm here now actually I'm sitting in Würzburg on a level of 400 meters. Will it also affect me?
Well, I so far just spoke about climate, but then there are other things. Climate also has a link with weather. So storms, dry harvests, wildfires of the forests, and refugee problems will be effects of global warming that would also touch Würzburg. I mean, some 5 years ago, we had a large number of refugees coming into Europe, chiefly from the Near East. And roughly 1 million people reached Germany. And this was the trigger for a political crisis in Germany. And the same in Switzerland and England and many other places. And this was just a tiny bit of what would happen if the sea level was rising. Some 800 million people in Asia are living just at the border of the sea. All the boom towns in Asia, in Japan, in India, in China, but also Indonesia, etc., they are all directly at the coast. So imagine not 1 million, but 800 million people are swarming out to have their living in Europe or in Siberia or somewhere else. A political catastrophe of sorts.
So in other words, the climate change will have consequences for everybody. You cannot escape these consequences wherever you live. So you will be hidden dramatically by the climate change wherever you were. So therefore, putting every effort into staying at this 1.3 degrees level or at least 2 degrees should be the primary focus.
Yes.
Okay. Now coming back to you, as you already mentioned, you were president of the Wuppertal Institute, but on your CV, to be honest, your CV looks like it takes 2 hours to grab at least partially the CV, and I will not even try to put everything here. But nevertheless, I want to, let's say, mention at least some points from your previous. Of course, you're professor of biology, or you were professor of biology, and still are, I think, in Freiburg also. And you are memberships of different institutions. So you were, first of all, member and former president of the Club of Rome. You're a former member of the German Parliament. You're member and co-chairman of the International Resource Panel of the UN Environment Programme. I have to read that, otherwise I will forget 50% of that. Awards, I would even say countless awards, just to name a few. You're carrier of the Deutsche Umweltpreis, which is handed out by the president of Germany, the German Environment Prize of the Deutsche Bundesstiftung Umwelt. You're a Knight of the German Order of Merit. To be honest, as a German, I only know that as Bundesverdienstkreuz. It took me a while to come up with the English translation. And you author a couple of books, including The Factor 4, Doubling Wealth, Having Resource Use, and other books, which can be certainly considered as milestones for sustainability. And as already mentioned, you were the first president of the Wuppertal Institute of Climate, Environment, and Energy. And at present, this is certainly one of the major think tanks in the world with respect to climate change and sustainability. So what was the intention of this institute when it was founded?
Well, let me first correct you a little bit in your pronunciation. The book is Doubling Wealth, Halving Resource Use, not helping.
Oh,
halving
this was
resource use, meaning you can do 4 times better. you can extract from 1 kilowatt hour or from 1 gallon of water or from 1 ton of minerals 4 times more human wealth. Meaning that the typical scare by economists and politicians that we need more energy to be prosperous is complete nonsense. Essentially, they always say about a steeply rising demand of energy. And I say, no. We have a steeply rising demand of wasting energy, which is different from real demand. Okay, this was more or less my insight in the 1980s.
But I think it's also very noteworthy and positive because, as you said, usually if you start talking about saving energy and so on, people always think of this is something bad. And I think it's a very important thing that this is really pointed out. This is not necessarily something bad.
Yeah. And the then Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia, who actually also was earlier the Lord Mayor of Wuppertal, Johannes Rau, and later he became the federal president. He knew me quite well and was learning that this guy, at the time living in Bonn, as director of the Institute for European Environmental Policy, had those crazy ideas of quadrupling resource efficiency. He said, oh, boy, this is what we need. I mean, people become concerned about climate change. And here come people, intellectuals, who seem to know something about engineering also and politics. I think he could be a person for a newly created institute for climate, environment, and energy.
So in other words, this Wuppertal Institute was founded around your book initially.
Well, the book was not yet published, but Johannes Rau nevertheless knew
the ideas. Yeah,
it was actually published 3 years, first in German, although it was written in English. But the English publisher was much slower than the German one.
Okay.
Anyway. It was a bestseller for half a year, and it was translated into Chinese and Japanese and Spanish and essentially all international languages, and has impressed the discussion on climate change. People began to understand that it is not something directly related to weather. It was essentially an engineering and political issue to allow engineers, managers, investors, consumers, traders, etc., to think new on what can we do to be prosperous and at the same time climate friendly. This was sort of an inbuilt clash. Either you can have good climate or you can have a good health, a good well-being. It looked like mutually exclusive. And then come those guys in Wuppertal telling the world, oh, no, it is much simpler. And then in parallel, also friends in Germany and in Denmark and many other countries began to understand that solar energy could be available. And that actually brought me into the federal parliament, where my friend Hermann Scheer, he was an old, passionate member of parliament. He said, we can do a solar energy revolution. And so I was friends with him, helping him to launch that renewable energy law in the parliament that was past my Wuppertal engagement. And this also has been a wonderful message for people concerned about climate.
One consequence of this law could be seen on my roof. So of course I have a 10 kilowatt peak PV device on the roof, which is let's say that beats together then this point. Today, what is the Wuppertal Institute doing today? It has evolved quite a bit also, of course, during these years.
Well, it always depends a bit on who is leading.
Mm-hmm.
My direct successor was Peter Hennecke,
mm-hmm.
who was absolutely formidable in energy efficiency. He was much better than I. So he emphasized that. And at the time when I was in the parliament already, he ran the institute very, very well, essentially with the energy and in part also materials efficiency agenda.
Mm-hmm.
But then after a while he retired. I mean, at the age of 65, that's the German law, you retire. And then they got a new man, Professor Schneidewind.
Mm-hmm.
He also was a university president before, and I liked him a lot. And he is a physicist, and he continued the great tradition of resource efficiency, but he also said, well, we also have to think of a major philosophical and political transformation. So he made the great transformation the main agenda of the Wuppertal Institute, while certainly not diminishing or forgetting the old tradition.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, however, he left the institute, is now Lord Mayor of the city of Wuppertal.
Okay.
But I'm sure the tradition will stay. They have 250 staff, I believe more than 200 really good scientists and engineers, and also a lawyer and natural scientist, and etc. So the institute is flourishing. It's one of the major think tanks worldwide, helping governments worldwide and private companies moving into the direction of, let me say, factor 4.
Okay. Now, Ernst, if I see a lot of scientists working in the Wuppertal Institute from the beginning up to now, we are all aware that scientists usually are not selected for their communication skills, and often communication between scientists and the society is kind of difficult. What was the let's say the philosophy of the Wuppertal Institute in this context?
Well, I was extremely lucky. A few months after the founding of the Wuppertal Institute, I noted that the head of the German journal Bild der Wissenschaft, which is sort of the German equivalent to the Scientific American, the chief journalist of that, for some odd reasons, left that journal. And I was a friend of him and called him and asked him if he would care to become the chief communicator of the Wuppertal Institute. And he said, "That's great, that's fantastic, I will do that." So we had the top German language science journalist as our communicator. So this was absolutely fabulous. Half a year later, the Institute was visible not only in the German language, but worldwide. Although we were completely new and had nothing really yet to show, but the communication was perfect.
And this was certainly a kind of an invention almost. Science communication was not really known at that time. Today, we are all aware, we have all this fake news around. We have, if you go to the social media, you see news about climate change is not real, other things are not real. We don't want to start to talk about American politics. But do you think that today there is even a kind of a duty for a scientist, at least to actively participate in the discussion in society?
I would say yes. I was living in California in the early 2000s, and it was at the time when Al Gore was the vice president. And he wrote a book, An Inconvenient Truth. And then a cartoonist showed a picture, he created a picture of a cinema with two films. One, An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. He also had made a film out of it. And the other, A Reassuring Lie. Meaning, lying instead of looking at truth. And then the people going to the cinema all opt for a reassuring lie. Nobody goes into an inconvenient truth. This is part of the central problem of our days. It is so wonderful, reassuring to get stupid lies from people like Trump. This is the major problem of today's politics, that stupid or nasty or certainly not truthful politicians are out there who tell the people, well, you can be very comfortable, there are no problems at all, etc. And they get majorities. I mean, the same was with Boris Johnson. He also thought climate change is not a reality. And other people said, well, refugee problems are more important than climate problems, period. So communication of the real dangers is extremely important. And here I must introduce, of course, you know that, Greta Thunberg from Sweden. At the age of 15, she sort of had the instinct, the understanding that this brutal lying or neglecting is a disaster for her generation. And she got the youth of Europe and partly of the world to take to the streets and saying, we will no longer accept this folly. The protesters, the Fridays for Future. And I got friends with Greta Thunberg. I met her at a wonderful conference with 500 pupils of schools of Europe, and found her perfectly credible. And to my pleasure, it was that she also found me credible.
Which is easy, by the way, Ernst. Okay, so I think Greta Thunberg was certainly also for scientists a kind of a wake-up call, because I think many scientists, and I don't want to exclude me, now have started to rethink their position. And also the Scientists for Future are now there, who then really say we need to raise our voice in this context. And for me, Trump, I'm coming from infection biology. So for me, it's I didn't have this name on my list, by the way. I tried to avoid that wherever possible, but it is not possible, to be honest. And for an infection biologist, it's merely incredible. He's responsible for hundreds of thousands of death people in the United States, and this is really absolutely unbelievable. But Corona, we will have a vaccine. So in 1 year, I'm quite sure that the Corona problem is gone. But for climate, there will be no vaccine. This is the bad news.
But before we continue, let me show you this picture.
Ah, okay. Very nice. This is very nice. Thanks. Now, we have already mentioned that you have been a former president of the Club of Rome, but maybe one word to the Club of Rome. So it was before your time as a president of the Club of Rome, but nevertheless, they came out in '72 with their report, The Limits of Growth, which was kind of at these times a game changer. Although it turned out at the end that, but would you agree that this was really changing the perception in certain means?
Absolutely. The book, The Limits to Growth, sold 30 million copies in all languages of the world, essentially. I think the German alone was 2 million or so, I don't know. And it was full of alarm and with a central truth that a limited planet cannot absorb unlimited growth. As simple as that.
Simple maths at the end.
Yeah. We now discuss it with regard to climate. That's one element of limits to growth. And the same can be said about the availability of drinkable water. It can be said about biodiversity. I mean, the growing human population is destroying year by year by year tens of thousands of animal and plant species. They are gone forever. We are living through the sixth extinction period. In very old geological times, I'm talking about 60 million years, there was the last of that waves. And now we humans in the so-called Anthropocene are creating the next big extinction wave of animals and plants. And unless and until we learn to deal with the limits to growth, we are losing the game.
Mm.
So the Club of Rome was heroic in the late 1960s, early 70s. The book Limits to Growth came out in 72. And I joined the Club of Rome only in 1991 and was co-president together with my Swedish friend Anders Wickman. And we did a new book which is trying to update from the Limits to Growth. Mm-hmm. And it's called Come On. Come on in the English language has two different meanings. One is, come on, don't be silly. And the other is, come on, join us. And so the 3 chapters of the book are, chapter 1, come on, don't tell me the current trends are sustainable. They are not. And the second part is, come on, don't stick to outdated philosophies. We need a new one. And the third part is, come on, join us on an exciting journey towards a sustainable world. And in the first one, we give credits to the limits to growth. In the second one, we say the prevailing thinking in the United States, in much of Europe, in much of Asia, but even more so in the developing countries, is growth, growth, growth. So the opposite of what the Club of Rome has been saying. And it is not just a question of somewhat better politics and economics and engineering. No. That's too simple. We have to go into the depth of wrong thinking, also making us vulnerable to the reassuring lie, So the second chapter is the most radical. Don't stick to outdated philosophies. And then the third one is practical policy in agriculture, in transport, in urbanization, in population stabilization, in energy, financial markets, in joining of different countries together, hoping to solve the problems jointly instead of rival games like President Trump has been advocating all the time. So for him, the role of the nation is rivalry, which is completely mad. Okay, so this book is a lot more sophisticated than The Limits to Growth, but it is building on the heroic innovation in literature, in science, in politics of the Club of Rome at its early beginning.
Yeah, so I think for President Trump, reading more than 140 signs on Twitter might be hard, but I hope for the students watching this is certainly something worth to read, but because it's about the future. And I think this optimism that if you really start doing things that you can really change something, I think this is also something which goes beyond with respect to sustainability, which is in this book. And I think that's very...
Well, maybe I can add the following. It is published by Springer, and Springer has contracts with essentially all universities of the world that students get free electronic access to Springer publications. And the universities give a lump sum to the publishing company. So for you as students, you are lucky you can read it without paying.
And this is, by the way, also true for our students because we have a contract with Springer. So also in our case, it's for free. So that's cool. Usually at that point, I always talk with my guests about their dreams as a child and so on. In your case, to be honest, the situation is a bit different. Why? Because Ernst, you are coming from the von Weizsäcker family, and maybe in our study course we have students, as I said, from 65 nations. I'm not so sure that everybody is really familiar with this family. So please allow me to give maybe 3 or 4 lines to introduce that family, that people have an idea where you were born in. Now, just to name a few persons in your family, of course, your father, he was a very, very, very renowned physicist, Professor Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, and he worked as a scientist, but he was also asked by our former Chancellor Willy Brandt to become president of Germany, which, by the way, he declined. But your uncle, who is Professor Richard von Weizsäcker, and politician, he was actually the president of Germany, and of course an active politician, as you also were. And I think what is really, I think it's not exclusive, but striking for the family von Weizsäcker is that all people had a very thorough and painful, I would say, even examination of their role in German history, which is kind of, I consider that as an exceptional and exemplary in Germany. And with this little background of the family, I know this is a rhetorical question, but did this omnipresence of politics and science in your family influence your career path and development?
Well, yes. I mean, at our breakfast tables also when I was a child, politics was normal. People would know the Cold War, the social difference between rich and poor, the technological questions about atomic energy, and all that. I was familiar with that. And later, when I was a student, I was also in the student representation. I became interested in getting education and qualification closer to the poor people. At that time, when I was a boy and had my final school examination, meaning access to university, only 6% of my age group had access to universities, and 94% had not. And this I found absolutely scandalous. So, as a representative of the students of the University of Hamburg at the time, I co-organized a big demonstration, we call it in German. 10,000 students took to the street protesting against the completely underdeveloped education system. That was politics, based on my experience that many of my age group had no privileges of that kind. And then, of course, I was a member of the Social Democratic Party with a strong emphasis on social justice. And my uncle, Richard von Weizsäcker, was with the Christian Democrats, which is more or less the Conservative Party. But I had never any political quarrel with him. We were friends. He was sort of on the social and peace-oriented part of his party, and I was interested in the needs for peace, of course, very important at the time of Willy Brandt, and what we can do to make also the rich and industry, etc., happy and cooperative, instead of just always clashing. So we got along very well with each other, belonging to the opposite parties. I mean, this is almost the antagonism to today's USA, where between Democrats and Republicans, it's almost impossible to cooperate. And this is the specific weakness of America.
We have to hope that this doesn't develop in Germany, because some tendencies also go in this direction. But your example exemplifies that within the family, it's normal that it's normal that you have people, not just within the family, of course, but it's normal that you have people with acceptable different political insights and so on. And it's important that all of them discuss. And I think your uncle, Richard von Weizsäcker, there is no doubt that as a president, he was respected by virtually all other parties. So he was a president who was really a president of Germany. And this is also something, when I look to the States, which is certainly different. Yeah. Now, the Fridays for Future, we already mentioned it, and Greta Thunberg, they rang the alarm bells with respect to the climate change and sustainability. So if one thinks of politics, but if one thinks of democracy, couldn't be then a technocratic government be the solution, that scientists say, okay, we take over and then we do everything because science tells us? Would that be a good way?
I would say, historically, it is true that if politics becomes too conflictual and people have no orientation anymore, a technocratic temporary government is a good choice. But it's not a choice for the long term. the long term also has to be carried by a common understanding of where to go, not only how to go. The question of direction, like, for instance, international peace. The coming to power of Willy Brandt from the opposition ranks was his view, his vision, that the Cold War has to be ended. It's not a technological question, it's a political question. And this had so much support in the public that he became the German chancellor.
Mm-hmm.
And that helped greatly prepare the détente policies in Europe and then worldwide, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and the beginning of cooperation between East and West. The trouble, however, was that once the East-West conflict was over, capital became arrogant. During the Cold War, it was still necessary for the conservative parties, for the governments, to cooperate with capital, and it was essential for capital to cooperate with the government, because they had to prove that market economy, freedom of speech, freedom of press, etc., what they always did not have in the communist countries, was worth defending, worth increasing. But when the Cold War was over, capital had no need of the state any longer. At least they thought so. And from that time on, you had the rift growing between poor and rich. And this is our today's situation. Particularly strong in America, but also in Brazil, in South Africa, in China, and many other countries. The gap between rich and poor has been increasing. So today's redirection of politics also has to overcome this fundamental injustice.
Mm-hmm. But this is not necessarily something which can only be done by a technocratic regime. This is something which needs just another thinking and should be based on a democratic process, which
Absolutely.
should be way more sustainable in this case.
Yeah.
Now, you have mentioned Willy Brandt. I already said that Willy Brandt asked your father to become the president of Germany, but your father, of course, also was a very, very prominent and good scientist. And he, in the period of the Second World War, he was in the German atom program developing nuclear bombs. But later, when the discussion came up in Germany that also Germany should start developing own tactic nuclear bombs in the Cold War, or at least have own nuclear bomb, he strongly opposed that. Now, nuclear bombs are now, for a good reason, no more a discussion in Germany. But nuclear power is still a big discussion, and it's an upcoming discussion. So many people now think that, and many publications and many also organizations propose that nuclear power could be a solution with respect to the climate change. Is this correct?
It is correct that the kilowatt hour from nuclear does not emit much carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases. And this, of course, is the argument by the nuclear lobby. The trouble is that there are non-climate related dangers in the nuclear energy that can be just as gruesome as global warming. So I am still extremely strongly against the nuclearization of the energy world. Let me take the most conspicuous danger, that is the close technical and physical neighborhood between so-called peaceful nuclear and nuclear arms. An atomic scientist who works on electricity production knows perfectly well which steps have to be done to turn the nuclear power into a nuclear weapon. And if the knowledge of this horrendous kind of weapon is spread around the world, including in failed states which have no government to speak of, this can be the Third World War, which would be 100 times worse than the Second World War. So it's really playing with fire. If people say, well, we only want to produce kilowatt hours, nothing else. This is a lie. It's a reassuring lie, once again. But then there are also problems of the civilian use of nuclear power. We have seen that in Chernobyl. We have seen it in the Fukushima disaster in Japan. And we see it also with aging nuclear installations. I'm living close to France, and the French still have, I don't know, about 40 or 50 nuclear plants, and they are getting old, and they have to, remove them. And then the removal of the fissionable material is a very, very unpleasant affair. You can try to sink it into the ground, but that should be managed for another 100,000 years. And I'm not sure if civilization is always capable of doing that.
At least in history, not yet. So the 100,000 years stable history we did not yet reach. I think this is clear. But if I now these arguments, I think they are clear cut. But however, if I would argue now that just from a purely economic point of view, that I say nuclear power is the cheapest thing to rescue the climate, would you agree with someone arguing in this direction?
No. It is correct that a 30 years old nuclear plant where all the investment costs have been written off can produce electricity at the price in the vicinity of 4 euro cents kilowatt hour. But in the meantime, the solar revolution has led to a situation where in Africa, that is year 2020, there was an auction from Ethiopia to any electrical utility of the world to make a proposal, and the winner was actually an electrical utility from Saudi Arabia offering a very large solar field with a guaranteed price of $2.50 per kilowatt hour. So, beating nuclear in Ethiopia.
That's incredible.
And I'm just learning in Chile, in the meantime, it's even lower. So I believe that a good economist would under today's conditions, not go for nuclear, except for those economists who happen to live in a militarized country with nuclear weapons, because there much of the costs are absorbed by the military budget. And then you can make dumping offers to the industry. But this is, again, some kind of a political lie.
And even in Germany, just as a reminder, I think the auctions for PV are now in the range of maybe 6 to 7 euro cent, which is also unbelievable low for Germany. Nobody, even I would have not foreseen that 15 years ago, that the prices go so rapidly down. And this is way lower than, for example, the 11.5, depending on the exchange price of the Hinkley Point C guaranteed price for 35 years, which is double the price of a newly constructed.
Absolutely, yeah.
So even here in Europe, you can produce the electricity cheaper with other renewable energy sources. Maybe at that point, a question: if we want to achieve this 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, let's say, target agreed upon in Paris 2015, what are now the most central steps we have to take now? What do we need to do? Where do we need to start?
Well, countries like Switzerland, Austria, Iceland have already reached a situation where they can decarbonize down to zero, essentially, for their electricity production. In Iceland, they have thermal energy from the ground. In the alpine countries, they have hydro electric power. And the solar energy and wind energy you mentioned can make up for the rest of the demand. And secondly, using the factor 4 philosophy, we don't need so many kilowatt hours once we really learn to become efficient. Today's LED light bulbs are 10 times more electricity efficient than the old light bulbs that our parents used. So that's one example out of 100 we have been presenting in the Factor 4 book. So there is no technological need for coal, oil, and gas. But in developing countries, in countries like India, Colombia, South Africa, they have a lot of coal. And in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, etc., they have a lot of oil or gas. And for them, not to use this essentially zero-cost materials makes them addicted to using fossil fuel. And if they, as nations, say this is exclusively our business, which energy to use, they will produce so much carbon dioxide that the 1.5 degrees goal, desired goal at the Paris Agreement, will become completely illusionary. Even 2 degrees is a complete illusion as long as the developing countries plus some industrialized countries like Russia and Poland and Kazakhstan, and in a different manner, Canada and the USA and Venezuela also, have such a plenty of fossil fuels, and they don't want to go out. So, what can we do? I think the best answer, which we also describe in our command book, is the so-called budget approach, which the advisory council of the German government on long-term environmental policies has proposed some 11 years ago, which is the following. They say, let us give each country a permit for emissions of carbon dioxide, per capita, identical, worldwide, under the condition that the overall permits, the total permits of the world, lead to not more than 2 degrees Celsius. But the old industrialized countries, including Germany, have already more or less eaten up all their permits. And they would now have to go shopping to countries like India or Colombia, rich in coal, and ask them, can we buy some permits from you? Because you have not eaten up everything. And then the Minister of Economic Affairs in India would immediately say, well, that's an offer. That's a very interesting idea. If you get some of our permits, we have less, but then we simply accelerate the transition to renewable energies and to energy efficiency, and in exchange, we get richer by your paying for the permits. So all of a sudden, the selfish interest of the country of India turns from new coal power plants to energy efficiency and renewable energies, and selling the thereby liberated permits to the Germans or to the Americans or Japanese. So this idea has been offered by Chancellor Angela Merkel at the Copenhagen Climate Summit of 2009. And then, unfortunately, countries like Poland, Saudi Arabia, USA, Russia said, oh no, why should we? Our economy is living from fossil fuels. How can we possibly agree to such folly? And then she pulled it back and said, okay, we cannot, as Germans, do it alone. It would give us a big economic disadvantage against Russia and other countries. So it is a sleeping idea. But with the help of Fridays for Future and the help of scientists showing the enormous dangers of global warming, I believe that 2 or 3 years from now, we can resurrect the idea into the climate diplomacy, the annual meetings of the Climate Convention, and maybe we have a chance either of really adopting the budget approach or finding some compromise which at least leads to fulfilling the Paris Agreement.
And you are, if I listen to you, you're still optimistic that we can do it. So your personal question, do you think in 2050 we will have reached the goals? Are you optimistic, or do you think we will have completely failed?
I think the chances are 50-50 more or less. what I expect and find unpleasant is that the fossil fuel lobby gets an agreement of carbon capture and storage, which means they can continue selling coal, oil, and gas and compensate for it with so-called offsets, which essentially means pumping carbon dioxide into the underground or into the deep sea. This is technically possible, but stupid. Because one day with an earthquake or I don't know what, it will all come back. So it is a fake instrument. But of course, it's a love affair between the fossil lobby and the carbon capture and storage idea. So knowing people's mentality and the political power of the fossil lobby, I fear this is the 50% of danger that we may come close to the Paris goal by 2050, but that this will not be the solving of the problem. But with a revolution in terms of energy efficiency and solar, I mentioned that example from Ethiopia, as the counter strategy, that's also 50% probability. So I'm, at the end of the day, sufficiently optimistic so that I would never give up trying the beneficial option instead of the shaky option.
But I think there are good reasons to be optimistic. So I read just today that you cited some countries who changed their own economics, or at least electricity production to electric to climate neutral production. However, some of these countries were still the major producers of fossil fuels. As an example, Denmark, they export their fossil fuels and they didn't really reduce it. So in this case, one would say it's of no use to reduce your own carbon dioxide emission if you sell the fossil fuel. But they have decided now also that they want to stop fossil fuel production until 2050. And even Great Britain is now on the way. They also say we want to stop. And I think these are really important things that countries, Denmark is at least a pronounced part of their wealth is based on fossil fuels, that such a country also says, no, we want to stop it. And that's certainly something which helps in being optimistic.
I agree with that, but I happen to know the language of politicians in South Africa, in India, in China, in Colombia, I mentioned that country again, and Venezuela, who say, well, yes, those rich people in Denmark and UK, they can afford, but we cannot afford.
Yeah.
This is the typical language you hear from those developing countries. And therefore, I'm saying we have to create an incentive structure, making it profitable for India, South Africa, etc., to stop their present economy, make them richer by the transition.
I think that's out of question. But I think as long as countries like Denmark still produce oil, if I were an Indian president, I would say, well, if you cannot convince your own countries from going out into oil, how should you convince someone else based on incentive, which makes, of course, very much sense. Ernst, I think we could talk for 20 more hours, to be honest. It was really a pleasure and an honor to talk to you. And I think we have won many, many valuable insights. So first of all, thank you a lot, Ernst, that you had time for us to talk about this very important topic.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure, Joe.
Oh, thanks. And I also want to thank the listeners and the viewers. So the shortened version of this will be on YouTube, and the full version of the ProfsCast with Ernst Ulrich von Weizsäcker will be on the platforms like Spotify and so on. Thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye.